Hi guys, in this video I'm going to go over how to set up the perspective equipment schedule component dynamically. That way it pulls your events and your items or your groupings of events from the database. This is one way to set it up dynamically. I know I'm just trying to sneak back onto this channel after not posting anything for 8 months, but I hope you understand. I am sitting in my new house. As you can see, construction paper there on the window to keep the light out until I get my power shade. I do have an Ethernet cable there. Hopefully that's going to be a future project, but yeah, I'm done. I moved into my house and now I want to get back to creating videos. I'm not even sure if I'll remember how to edit a video after this, but I'll have to get back into the groove. So yeah, in this video, I'm going to show you how to set it up dynamically. I have this very simple example here, very ugly, but it's functioning. It's dynamic in 3 ways. So I'm pulling these items here. So this is what groups my events together. This could be like a facility, or this could be a line or a machine. It's kind of whatever you're using the equipment schedule component for. These are coming from a database being dynamically queried. These events are also coming from a database, the start time, the end time, this label here coming from a database, and then also what's not coming from a database but is also dynamic is this start time selector, or these 2 date time selectors, and it changes the start date for this component. So hopefully this project would be useful for you. I think if you're watching this video, it probably would be. So let's just go ahead and get started. I'm going to show you kind of how I'm starting, or where I'm starting from. That way you can translate this into your context, because it's going to be different. It's always tricky to know how to set up these examples, because you want it to be somewhat involved and somewhat realistic, but also if it's too realistic, then the downside is then the video is very long and it's still not going to match your environment exactly. So I figured it'd be better to just kind of give an example and make it easy to translate into the context you'll be using the equipment schedule component in. And yeah, I thought that'd be better than just to create a several hours long video, how to set up the database model and all of that, since it's going to vary from use case to use case. Okay, so let's get started. I will launch the ignition design. I'll show you what I have set up on the back end or on the database side. It's not very complicated. Let me actually create a new project. We'll call it like equipment schedule, or actually let me call it something different. Asset scheduler. That'll make sense why. Scheduler. I called my 2 example database tables asset and asset event. All right, I'll select the database I have set up. It's a Microsoft SQL Server, but again, this is very similar in MySQL or Postgres or any other database you might be using. I think this example on the database side is simple enough that you could take it and run with it, which I hope to demonstrate here. Okay, so while that's starting up my project, well, I guess it doesn't take that long. Let me, yeah, this is a brand new project, obviously. Let me show you what the database looks like. So I have SQL Server Management Studio open here. I actually, for work, started using Azure Data Studio. I have mixed feelings about it, but I do love the extensions you can get for it, and the fact that it's like a VS Code environment. I like that. I don't know, some people might not, but I have this TWP schema, and then inside the schema I have my 2 tables. Actually, TWP database, and then I have this WMS schema. WMS, this is like a fictitious example, but that's supposed to be like work order management, maybe. I actually don't remember why I called it WMS, but that doesn't matter. I have these two tables, and inside the asset table, so I actually don't have any assets in here or asset events. I wanted to kind of, on this part, I wanted to start from scratch. Okay, and we have a brand new project, so I think that should give you a good baseline, a good understanding of what we're starting with for this project. And just to show you that I can see my asset and my asset table, let me execute here. Probably because I don't have my schema here. I don't really use this tool. It's not very useful. I usually just have ADS or SSMS open. Okay, so for the perspective side, let me just create a new view. This is not very important, obviously. I'll just call it schedule. This is kind of all setup stuff before we get to the actual meat of this video. Okay, so this view here, I'm not going to put in too much thought, but it's a flex container in a column position. So let me just throw on some components onto the screen just so it makes it a little more realistic. Asset scheduler, and I'll also explain what I mean by asset. And then let me put in a row. This, we may or may not get to this row in this video, just kind of depends on how long this takes. And then let me put in a equipment schedule component here, and then a column. I don't know, this is obviously up to your personal preference, but a lot of my views I set up this way. So I'll have like a title, like I called it here, asset scheduler. I'll have kind of the main purpose of the view. It'll usually be like a table or maybe a schedule component like this. I'll talk about my opinions on this component later if I don't forget. And then on the right side, this is just how I set it up. On the right side of the component, in the main space here, I'll have this container for buttons. So like usually the buttons, I mean, this is just my preference. I'll remove this and add an icon like material add or something, just like this. Just like this, you know, I think that's pretty common way to set this up. Let me just rename some of these components, that way when we browse later. C flex body. I started using this naming convention. I used to just use flex body, but the C or the R denotes if it's a column or a row root container. I don't know if that's all that helpful, but C flex actions, whatever, that doesn't really matter. Okay, so I have my component here, and there's two things that to make this component useful. There are two properties here that you should make dynamic, which we'll write queries for. It's this items here. This is actually kind of confusing, surprisingly. It was at least confusing for me. The items and the schedule events, to me, it didn't make sense why they were almost called, you know, the properties were almost synonyms, items and schedule events. I'm not sure where those names come from. They might come from the equipment schedule and the vision system. I'm not sure, and they probably just use the same names. That's what I'm guessing, because otherwise it doesn't really make sense. Items here, the short answer are these. In our case, they'll be assets, or it can be like a line or a facility. So this here, the new item label, if you open this, you'll see new item. We can call this like line 1, and you'll see it changes here. This is what the item is, and then the actual components, or the actual events that show up here are in this property scheduled events. We'll go over all the nuances of this, so I'm not going to get ahead of myself, but that was one confusing thing to me. So hopefully that doesn't trip you up, and I think it'll make sense once we go through this example. So let me go back into the database side. Since any dynamic system that uses the equipment schedule component will likely use a database. I mean, you could do it with tags, like a document tag in Ignition, but I think it obviously makes a lot more sense to do it in a database, at least in my mind. So that's how we'll set this up. So my assets, I tried to come up with a generic enough name, that way you can fit multiple things into this asset table. This could also be called like location or something. And what I imagine this table holds are things like lines, like a production line, or like a certain area, or it could be an asset, or it's a machine. It's sort of like a catch-all type of component, and then you have a very simple structure set up, obviously not to get away from the point of this video, but you could set this up in a tree data structure where you have an asset ID and then a parent asset ID. I actually want to do a video on that in the future and use the tree component perspective. I think those two things are very powerful, and I use them in a lot of my projects. Okay, so before I get way ahead of myself, let me insert some assets. We'll just do two just to keep it simple. So let me insert into wms.asset. So the columns I want to insert are name, description, asset type, ID. This is actually not, I mean, it's set up in a way that it could be a foreign key, but I don't have an asset type table just because I don't want to complicate it. Last modified by, this is going to be the Ignition username. So let me just call it admin. And last modified on, I think I already have an expression, but let me just do get date. There's a default expression if I remember correctly. Oh, of course, I'm already getting ahead of myself. Modified by, last modified on, values. Name, so we'll call this line 1. WMS line 1 or something. It doesn't, this doesn't really matter. And then the asset type, we'll just set that ID to 1. Realistically, if you'd have any serious database set up, you'd want to have a separate table for this asset type, that way you can filter on it if you needed to. Let's just call that line 2. And let me run these two statements. So the reason why I actually inserted asset first is because I have a foreign key set up on asset event, and asset in the asset event table, I have this asset ID here. That's a foreign key and it's not null. So if I tried to insert asset events before I had assets, it would yell at me. And also, if you think about the equipment schedule component as well, it doesn't even make sense to have schedule events without having items to put the events into. Okay, so now that we have a few assets, let me insert some asset events. So insert into wms.asset event, and here, so let me open these columns. Asset event ID is the identity column, so it's going to auto increment, but I'm going to insert name, description, start date, end date, asset ID, last modified by last. I know you're not watching this video to see me type, but I also wanted to kind of not assume a lot of this information, because I think it could be more valuable, and it doesn't take all that long to set this up. And somebody might find this valuable, how in this simple example I set up my database. So name, so this could be like, I don't know, line 1, event 1, description here. Actually, I'm not going to enter a description column, it's optional. So just to save a little bit of time in typing. So start date, this is where it gets interesting. Start date, if you look in the documentation, by the way, there's a new documentation site IA is using. They launched this last week. It looks completely different. I'm still kind of getting used to it. But if you look in the schedule events here, start date and end date are both datetime properties. I'm not sure if this is a SQL Server datetime. That's what I have my start date and end date columns. That's the type of those columns, date time. But I think it should work how I have it set up. If you see here, start date and end date are both date time types. So for this example, let me just do, I'm gonna generate a few, I think it's date add, hour minus, so I'm just gonna generate a few sample events. So this is, I'm just putting in a few events with some sample date times. So I'll do this first value or this first row completely, and then I'm going to speed it up when I edit this video. That way you don't have to watch me type. So line 1, event 1 is my name, and then date add. All this function does, it just says get the current date. So whatever timestamp it is now, 7:40. And then subtract -5 units. In this case, it's an hour. So the event is going to go from t minus 5 hours, so 2:40 p.m. And then the end date is going to be plus 2 hours, so 9:40. It's going to go from 2:40 to 9:40, this event, this first one here. The interesting column that I want to talk about before I speed it up is this asset ID. This asset ID, like I said, there's a foreign key setup between the asset event table and the asset table. So anything I specify in here must first exist in this asset table. I should have demonstrated that, but just trust me, it's going to scream at you if you want to add in an asset ID that doesn't exist. So let's just look at my asset table just to refresh your memory from wms.asset. If we look here, we have line 1, and then this asset ID column is an integer column. So since it's line 1, event 1, let's just set this to 1. That's my asset ID. Last modified by is going to be admin. The idea is to use this last modified by and use the ignition signed in user. I think that's pretty common. And then last modified on is just get date. This is just current timestamp pretty much. I think you can also timestamp, probably use this. I know I used to use this in MySQL, but the SQL Server version is get date. I think both of them should work. So not very complicated. The most tricky part here and important for us to set up is this asset ID to link the asset, which is line 1, line 2, or it could be like a machine 1, or it could be a facility, whatever you want to use for this table. You could also call this table something else, and then in that case your asset event would be like location event or machine event, something like that. So obviously set up your database appropriately to what makes sense, but then you're actually relating the assets and the asset event. So this asset event belongs to the asset ID of 1, which is line 1. So pretty self-explanatory. I don't think it's all that complicated. So let me copy this, create a few more events. I'll speed this up. That way you don't have to watch me type for very long. Okay, so I have these events. I tried to make it so that the time slices are all kind of interesting. That way they'll show up and not overlap in the equipment schedule component. So let me just run this. And of course, I'll link this script. I mean, it's not that complicated, and it probably won't be that useful because you can look up SQL syntax online. So maybe I won't link this, maybe I will. We'll see if I remember. Okay, so let me just execute this statement here, and you could see that I have 6 rows affected. And let me just make sure that I have so that I have values here again before I go back to ignition. So if you look here, I have my events. So line 1, I have 3 events. Line 2, I have 3 events, and they're all have a certain time. And then you can see the asset IDs. This is what I was talking about earlier. So this is belongs to line 1, belongs to line 1, and then so on. Okay, so that should be, we should be done with Azure Data Studio for a while, if not for the rest of this video. Okay, so now let's go back here and let's create our named queries. We'll need 2 named queries at the very least. This is a simple example, of course. Let's call this get assets. So the basic idea of our named queries, why we're creating those queries, is we want our equipment schedule to be component to be dynamic. In what ways? Well, we want to pull in our lines dynamically, and then we want to also pull in our schedule events dynamically. That's at the very least to make it dynamic. In my mind, that's what that means. Okay, so let's go back to named query again, redo this. So we're going to write 2 queries. One is going to be get asset, and the other is going to be get asset event. Makes sense, right? So yeah, I don't think any of this is super complicated, but I wanted to do kind of a minimal but complete project, if that makes sense. Okay, so let me do this. Get asset, let me actually call this get assets. That way it kind of implies that it's going to get all of them. And then here, I don't even need my parameters. And we're just going to do select. Actually, this might be interesting here. Let's do select star for now from wms.asset. There we go. So if we go here to test, we see that our assets are coming through just like we just saw in Azure Data Studio. Okay, this is the first time that it gets interesting. So let me take a screen snip of that. If we go back to, just so I have this off to the side here, if we go back to the ignition or the perspective page here and just take a look at the items object here, this is where our assets are going to live. So like line 1, just like this, but it's going to come from our database. That's what makes it dynamic. If we look here, the properties, so this items property is an array or a list, and then it has these objects. It's made up of, it's an array of objects or a list of dictionaries, whatever the Python terminology is. And we have these properties ID and label. It's pretty important to get these right. If you don't, if you mess up the capitalization or the spelling or call them something different, it's not going to work. Let me demonstrate that real quick. So we have my asset ID is going to be the item ID, since I know it's a unique field. So 1, 2, and the name will be my label. So like, for instance, if I call this, I want to retrieve all of the values there. So if I say asset ID as ID or asset ID, let me just leave it like that. And then name, description, these are, I'm looking off to the side here, type ID, last modified on, last modified by. Okay, so if I go here, we see that the query executes. So let me save this. Let's go back here and then create a binding on the items property here. Go to query and then select this. I'm going to select JSON. I mean, I like working with JSON, and I'll show you why actually. It might be necessary to do the JSON return format. So we have my query here in the preview window. But if we select OK, you see that we have a component error. That's because it expects, if you look here, an ID and a label, and it needs to be this way. It needs to be capitalized this way as well. So if I go back to, let's go back to my query, and then we can just say asset ID as ID, and then name as label. So let's save this again, and then go back here, and let's refresh this binding. And you see it's still erroring out because it needs to be called. Well, actually, let me show you here. ID label. Let me go here. ID, see that right away. And now our labels are coming through in the ID. I just wanted to demonstrate that it's very finicky if you don't set it up right. A lot of people ask on the forums why the equipment schedule component's not working, so I hope that demonstrates the point. Okay, so now let's fix this here. Just call it ID, call it label, and then these other properties, they're less important. I mean, it's like just meta information for the component. Okay, so we have one of the queries set up, and like you just saw, we have our lines set up here, line 1, line 2. These are the items again, and this binding is a very simple query binding here. There's no parameters or anything like that. Okay, so now let's write a query. This is the second part of making this component dynamic. Let's write a query to retrieve these scheduled events. Again, it's going to be very similar, and it's also similarly finicky and very particular. Notice here how the items property has an ID, but then if you go to the schedule events property, it has an item ID and a very particular capitalization. You have to follow that, or else your events aren't going to show up. So let's go back to our named query workspace, create a new query, and we can call this get asset events. And this naming convention, like ending it in a plural, kind of denotes that it's going to get all of them. In the real world, you wouldn't create a query like this. You would at least have a start date and an end date parameter, which if this video doesn't go very long, we might be able to add. Okay, so let me create a new query that's going to follow kind of the same setup as this. I had to pause the video, or pause my camera, because it has a 30-minute cap for recording, so that's where that break came from. Okay, so let me modify this query here. So instead of retrieving from asset, we're going to retrieve from asset event. And then the asset event table, if you remember what that looks like, let me show you here. So asset event here has a name, asset event ID. This will become our schedule event ID field. Start date, end date, these are also useful. And then this is going to be our item ID. So let me just quickly take a snip here. That way I can reference it off to the side. That's a tool I use all the time for work, snipping. Okay, so let me go back to the designer. And so let me call this asset event ID. And then here, remember what I was talking about. So I'll go back here, let me show you. So if you go to the scheduled events property here, our asset event ID is going to become our event ID. And then our asset ID is going to become our item ID. And then start date, notice this capitalization, lowercase first letter, and then every other word has a uppercase first letter. I forgot what that's called, camel case maybe. Can't remember. Our name is going to be called label. Lead time, we're not using that. So just remember this, you have to follow this structure exactly. And there are a few ways to do this. I'll talk about this in a second actually, so that it makes more sense. Let me go back here to my get asset events. So here, my asset event ID, remember it's called event ID. And then let me just put the asset ID right after here. Asset ID as item ID. It has to be this capitalization. Name, it'll be just label, I believe. I actually can't remember. Description. I don't think we have an asset type here. We also have a description. Instead of asset type here, we have start date as start date. And obviously in the same vein, we have end date as end date. So we have, I think we have all of our columns. Sweet. So let's just run this. Oh, let me remove these parameters, because ideally you would have parameters. Not ideally, but in an actual situation, you would have parameters, because you're not going to just retrieve all of them. If you think about using this component for a month in a production setting, you're going to have 1 million events potentially. So that can overload the component, just make the view very laggy, and you don't need to see that many events. Anyway, the component's not really made for it. It's not very useful at all. Okay, so in the testing section, you can see that I can execute this query and it returns my events. Not very interesting. So let me go back here. I saved the queries here, and now that I'm back in my equipment schedule component, let me just go to scheduled events and do pretty much the exact same thing as I did for assets. Select this asset events. This is what I was talking about earlier. So there are multiple ways to do this. So you could just leave asset event ID and not give it a name, and then do a transform. I think this is probably less efficient. In most cases, I don't think you're going to even notice a performance difference, but I think the script transform could be expensive. The downside of doing it this way is that it's pretty much tied to this component. Like you'll be hard pressed to find another situation where you're going to use this query and it'll be useful to you for it to be called event ID, if that makes sense. So yeah, the downside is this query will pretty much be for one use case only. The upside is that you're not going to have to do a script transform and cast your asset event ID as event ID in the script transform. If you're interested in what that would look like assume this part here is missing on all of these columns, then you'd have to go, let me just show you an example. Then you'd have to loop through, so let me initialize a new list, and then for ln value, so loop through each of the rows or each of the, actually let me set this to JSON. Now you're looping through object like a Python object. If you look here, return L, this is just the first object here, and then you would have to pretty much change the name here in your transform. I don't even want to work the rest of that out because it's not that useful. I already did it in the query and this should work. So let's see here. And you can see that my events showed up, and this is completely dynamic. And then my items are also dynamic. So these lines are dynamic, and the events here in the table are also dynamic. So let me try to display. So one thing that you could improve on right away is this chart comes up with a certain date range by default. And I noticed that it's not very useful. So maybe one improvement we'll make to this. I think I demonstrated the main point of this video that I wanted to demonstrate, but I'm just going to do kind of like a bonus. So let me actually make this grow. That way it fills up the rest of the space. I know I'm kind of clicking away and talking at the same time. Okay, here we are. Not a very pretty view, but you see that it defaults to like a certain, I don't know what this is, 25th, 26th. It defaults to like showing a week. So one improvement I want to make, and this is probably something you would make in the real world as well, is to have a date range selector. So instead of just showing 7 days of data, maybe you want to have it more dynamic. Okay, so let me add a row. So this is going to be a very simple fix that doesn't really have anything to do with queries, but it does make your component even more dynamic than we already made it by querying the events from the database. So let me just set this up very quickly. It should not take very long. And then I want to throw on a label. Actually, no, let's do date time. I can never remember which one of these is which. Okay, so date and time, I think it's this one here, and then another one. And in this container, oh, darn it. So I clicked F1 instead of F2. We'll call it R because it's a row. Flex dates. So something like this. And then we can call this DT start, DT end. All right, so that's already pretty good. Let's change this placeholder text to select start date. And then here, same thing. End date, let's change this row to justify end. That way move it kind of that way a little. And then also I'll put on a margin here, margin right 10 pixels. That way it's a little further apart. All right, now that we have this set up, obviously it's not very pretty, but I think that's not the point of this video. So now we'll go, the last thing we'll do for this equipment schedule component is we will add or bind this date range here, start date, to my property. So this is where it makes it really nice when you name your containers and also your components. So we'll go to start date value, just like that. And then it's probably going to give me an error. And here we'll select my date, the end date component here. I'm trying to talk and do stuff at the same time. I don't have enough brain cells for that. Okay, so let's test this out. So if we do February 1st and February 29th, then you can see that we have February 1st through the 29th. Obviously it's a lot better already than what it was. So let's go back to what, like the 18th and 22nd, so that we can see our events again. Okay, I think that hopefully that demonstrates at least the first part of this project, how to actually query events for the equipment schedule component from the database. If this is helpful, please let me know in the comments below, and I can do a part 2 on adding new events. It could be like maybe the start of a CRUD example, create, read, update, delete, simple database example. If you want to see that, I think it's more nuanced for this component than it is for like a database or a prospective table. Table kind of makes sense. There are a few ways to add schedule events, and I can talk about my preferred method. But if that would be useful for you, please let me know in the comments. And if there's interest, I can show also how to do that, how to add events here from the runtime, like in your session. So instead of doing it through the back end, how we did for these first 6 events, to actually, this is what that's the idea of this button here, is it would open up a form, and then we would enter, we would select like a start date, an end date. We'd set a name for the event and select one of our assets, so line 1, line 2, and then hit save, and then it would save that data to a database, and then refresh our equipment schedule component and show the event here. In that case, it's completely dynamic, and yeah, I think that makes sense. So if that would be helpful for you, please let me know in the comments below. Again, I thank you for watching, for subscribing, and for staying subscribed, even though I haven't posted a video for a really long time. I was busy, but I appreciate your support and for watching my videos. I will see you in the next video.